Hi, welcome back to the new show. I'm your host, Random Rob. Tonight I thought I'd do something a little different and talk about my experiences writing my first sci-fi horror story collection, and use it basically as an opportunity to encourage young writers and give them some advice about what I learned writing my book. Probably the most common question one gets is, what made you want to write a book? Well, since the time I was old enough to read, really, I quickly became very interested in science fiction, and fantasy and horror to a lesser degree. I didn't have the easiest time growing up. I was very shy and awkward. I was very smart, but not always the most articulate student. And science fiction embodied to me a kind of escapism that I just naturally craved. I wanted to live in those worlds. I wanted to live in a future with aliens and high-end technology, see humanity moving into space and so forth. That was always much more interesting to me than day-to-day life. I spent much of my time as a child in front of the TV watching Star Trek, Twilight Zone, Godzilla movies, Hammer horror films, The Outer Limits, and saw Star Wars for the first time at the age of 10. Completely blew my doors off. In school, I was always a pretty good English student, sometimes a very good and insightful English student, but I didn't really believe in my writing. In my early 20s, really didn't believe in myself as a capable writer, or artist, or musician for that matter. And between the ages of 20 and 50, got into food service as a way to get by. By my second year of college, I was pretty discouraged about my prospects of ever being an artist. At that age, mostly what I wanted was to be a graphic artist. So I spent 30 years in restaurants, and what I learned from it was, well, nothing really. I learned to cook, and I met a lot of people, and I talked to a lot of people, and I worked with hundreds of or thousands of wonderful people, but it never really fulfilled me much. And finally, when I was 50, after working at the same restaurant for some 12 years, I just came to a point where I couldn't do it anymore. The business had been taken over by new owners, and they weren't really interested in the restaurant itself and were converting the place, and I just got really fed up with the whole thing and put in my notice. And I had been thinking about writing. Having quite a bit of free time afterwards, it occurred to me to write, and my girlfriend at the time encouraged me. And this would be the first piece of advice I would give young writers, is you have to have time to write. And I don't mean you need an hour a day. I mean you have to have a long stretch of time to knock a book out. Writing is a very self-obsessive job to do, especially when you're dealing with fiction that deals with like monsters and futuristic technologies and stuff. You're gonna be spending a lot of time in your head. And that can be really hard to try to just nibble away at in little chunks every day. I'm not saying it can't be done, but I found in order to write my book, I needed a lot of time. So how did I get started? Writing your first story can be pretty difficult, because it's the one story you're going to write where you're going to overthink yourself the most and take the longest time doing it. I had always wanted to write a submarine story. I've always been a fan of the German film Das Boot. The idea of the story that came to me was, what if the Philadelphia experiment had been real and that the Nazis had tried to stop it? And that became the basis of my first story, The Displaced. And I went bananas researching this story. I researched it for weeks. I was looking up charts about military command in the Navy in Germany during World War II. I found a record of a submarine, the U-420, that had actually disappeared off the Irish coast shortly before the Philadelphia experiment was rumored to have happened. So right then I knew I was in. I was like, okay, this is the boat, this is my story. And this is the second bit of advice I want to give to writers, is don't go bananas doing research. Because whatever you end up writing, unless you're writing like unless you're writing a serious piece of historical fiction, like a long piece of historical fiction, most of the details you're looking up are never going to make it into the story you're writing. Only research what you absolutely need to get your story done. I wasn't planning to write a book at the time I wrote The Displaced. I just meant it as a kind of one-off just to see if I could do it. But the experience of it was so good, I decided to set myself a challenge and write a more complicated story. A story called A Single Man, which takes place in a future Saudi Arabia where a revolutionary group of women scientists release a retrovirus that kills off all the men in the country. And they form this techno-utopia, or I should say a techno-dystopia. The society I imagined in the story was shot full of all sorts of ironies and contradictions. Most of the narrative takes place from the point of view of Jenner, who is a genetically engineered three-armed man who is going to be the template for a new cloned slave race of men. Now, what I learned writing this story is don't make your narratives too complicated. This story really spun out of control. To me, it's probably, I think, the clunkiest story in the book. Not enough happens in it, but it was a good exercise in world building. And like my first story, I ended up taking too many notes for it. After I finished A Single Man, I began doing cold starts, not even really thinking of a title, just starting cold. Imagine a place, imagine a person in that place, what are they thinking, and just going from there. Every story I wrote after that basically wrote itself. This is the third piece of advice I'd want to give young writers. Try writing without researching, without notes. Try starting from nothing. Because in my case at least, I can tell you, I got my best results writing when I went in cold and had nothing on my mind. And once I started to trust that process, I really began to enjoy writing so much more. And I believe you will too. But it's a real hurdle of trust to get over. But it's an important one. You have to trust your ability to write. You have to assume that it's going to be there. You have to trust your muse. You have in a way to almost, you have to meditate in a way. You have to kind of empty your mind because, you know, I found in almost every case writing, anytime I had preconceived notions about where my story was going, as I would write it, I never ended up going in any of those directions. My stories always went in a direction that surprised me. I realized that the book I was writing kind of had a theme, and the theme was paying homage to many of the authors and stories that I grew up reading. So right away I knew this book was going to have a retro feel to it. I wanted the whole collection to feel like a book that would have been in my junior high library, you know, in the mid-1980s. I wanted it to read like that, I wanted it to feel like that. But almost like a book that was from another dimension, that was way more screwed up than the one we live in. An example of that kind of style would be my story The Martians, which I wrote basically as a very screwed up retelling of the Ray Bradbury story The Earthmen, about the first expedition to Mars. But I imagined the first expedition in my story coming from a United States where the KKK had taken over the country in the 50s and reinstituted slavery, and that the first astronauts to meet the Martians were black, were indentured slaves. And in my story I imagined that the Martian people had been the slave race of another species of Martians who had launched the failed tripod attack from Wells' War of the Worlds. And again, the point I want to make about writing cold is that whole story concept came out of nowhere and wrote itself. I just wrote it down. You know, the muse told it. I can't state that enough. You have to trust your ability to write. It's not about the preparation, it's about believing in it. Seriously. Now, I self-published my book through Amazon, and I have a copy here of my paperback version. And one thing I want to say about Amazon's paperback printing was the quality of this book was very nice. And I really liked being able to have this larger kind of print. Reminded me more of a high school text than a smaller paperback. Just really nice quality. But if you ever go through Amazon printing, as far as I could tell, you cannot update your manuscript once the paperback is printed. You have to make sure your manuscript is perfect before you send it to the printing department. Their Kindle department, you can update your manuscript as many times as you like. I think this really has to do with the print editions. You can't edit print editions once they've gone out. Now, after I finished my book, I was editing it for months. And at first, I sort of convinced myself that I could do a decent enough job editing it on my own for my purposes. I was really more interested in just having a book out there than actually having anyone read it. I got my girlfriend to edit it once over. I probably went through 8 edits of it and was still finding errors afterwards, and finally pulled it from publication. And this is another piece of advice I want to give. If you want to be a professional writer, you have to have your material professionally edited. There's just no way around it. I don't care how good you are at grammar and syntax and punctuation and editing other people's materials. When it comes to editing our own work, I sometimes think our brain has a blind spot to not see our own mistakes. You've probably noticed that if you've ever spent like 10 minutes on, Twitter or something composing a little paragraph about something people are talking about, and you get it perfect, and the moment you post it, you immediately see the errors. I don't think that's an accident. I think our brains actually don't like seeing our own mistakes, and it's one of the main reasons to get a professional editor to look at your work. And the last bit of advice I really want to give is about exposure. Nobody is ever going to look at your work if they don't know who you are. There are simply too many books out there, too many new authors, and the only way to stand out in a crowd is to get some recognition, whether it's from having a story published in a popular magazine or online publication, or even by getting a big enough social media following that you have a large enough audience to pitch your ideas to. But no book on the market stands on the merit of good writing alone. You have to get recognition, you have to have some kind of following. And if you're in a niche genre, or doing experimental kinds of fiction, you have to find the right venues to go through. My stories, for example, because they're retro in style and have a lot of Kafka-esque kind of magical reality to them, made them no-goes for most of the magazines that I sent them to. I tried sending all of my stories to traditional publishing houses, and they weren't interested. And I couldn't really blame them because what I was doing was something very niche and very specific. The good news is, and I've noticed this especially on Twitter, is that there's a really active, vibrant, supportive writing community. And there are a lot of professionally published authors out there who are giving out great advice, who can answer your questions. There's a lot of great editors who are looking for stuff to edit. And overall, I would say in the past few months that I've been on Twitter, the writing community there is really, generally speaking, really nice and supportive. Way more than writing groups I encountered on other social media. I was hard-pressed to find a good writing group on Facebook, for example. But Twitter's pretty good. And one final piece of advice I want to give, it's one of the more difficult ones. When I said earlier that writing is a really self-obsessive thing to do, you have to consider the effect that that's going to have on your relationships, and especially your personal relationships. In my case, writing my book was one of the contributing factors in me breaking up with my girlfriend of 4 years. And part of that was the fact that I was so focused on what I was doing, and I was expecting her to be supportive, but I was not being supportive of her creative efforts, and it, among other things that were happening, it put a wedge between us. When I hear from other writers who are in relationships or have a spouse and they talk about how they don't read each other's work, I totally understand why. You know, to paraphrase Harlan Ellison, when you're a writer, you're really married to your work, and it makes other relationships difficult. It's something that's not to be taken lightly. That's definitely something to think about. Well, that's all for now. I hope you appreciated my impromptu talk about writing my first book. If you're watching and you're writing your first book, good luck. Don't give up, but definitely get a professional to edit it and grow that social media following. And if you don't know how to do something, ask somebody who does, because there is a wealth of free info and advice waiting online if you just know to ask the right questions. So, this is Random Rob signing out from the new show, and I'll see you next time. Well, I think that's all for now. I appreciate you visiting at the new show. I hope you enjoyed my talk on writing. Are you a writer? What do you have a project you're working on that you want to talk about? No, no. Well, that's all for now. I hope you appreciated my impromptu talk about writing my first book. If you're watching and you're writing your first book, good luck. Don't give up, but definitely get a professional to edit it and grow that social media following. And if you don't know how to do something, ask somebody who does, because there is a wealth of free info and advice waiting online if you just know to ask the right questions. So, this is Random Rob signing out from the new show, and I'll see you next time.